intro started. And 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to another episode of Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Talk about what's on our hearts, what's on our minds, and talk to interesting people. All of us have a story. All of us have come from somewhere, and we typically pick up tools that help us as we continue down that road of life. And one of my guests today, Scott Curtis, is a self-described late bloomer, a stand-up comedian and podcaster. The journey that he's had has led him to redefine his life a little bit. I find that interesting, and I thought that would be an excellent story for us to share today. So with that said, thank you for coming on the podcast today, Scott. How are you doing, and Merry Christmas.
I'm doing well, and thanks for having me, Bo. This is a real honor to be on the podcast. I've listened to a few episodes, and it sounds like it's going to be a good one.
Well, I appreciate that. So tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? How did you get your start in life?
Yeah, I was born in Indiana, northern Indiana. Grew up in a little town called Lakeville that had no stoplights when I lived there, and then they put one stoplight in after I moved away. And it doesn't have a McDonald's. That tells you how small it is.
Sure.
And the junior high and high school were all in one building, so pretty small town. I grew up there. I stayed there and till I was 20 when I moved out of Lakeville, 18 or 20. And my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, we moved to. I moved to Indianapolis first. Yeah, I moved to Indy first, and she moved with me, and then we came back to South Bend because I took another job here, and then we've been together ever since. So I've never lived more than 3 hours away from where I grew up, and I was only in Indy for I think 2.5, 3 years.
Sure. Do you have a large family? Is that what keeps you in the area, or what keeps you stationed there?
A small family. I've just got one brother. My mom has passed away. My dad is 81, and he's still with us. My wife is the youngest of 11, and quite a few of her family are still around this area.
Nice. So, tell me about the area. I think of Indiana, and I don't know much about it. I'm from Wisconsin. I passed through it a couple times. I know that you guys are big into racing down there. You are still kind of tucked up on the lake, if I'm not mistaken, to a certain extent, to a small portion of you, right? Or do you have?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time on the shores of Lake Michigan looking for beach bass, my wife and I, because that is our pastime now that we're empty nesters. But Indiana, I think it's pretty typical of Midwestern type area. Of course, we got a lot of corn. We're known for that. I remember where I grew up, there was a cornfield behind me, cornfield to the east, and a cornfield to the north.
We have that in common. Yeah. It's a Midwestern thing, yeah. I think.
Yeah. So I feel like the few things that I dislike about Indiana is really the lack of culture and the lack of just people understanding what the world's all about. And I was one of those people. So, and I was always a real big music fan, along with stand-up comedy. Mm-hmm. Perspective, I obviously grew up before the internet age. I'm 56. And I really didn't get into the bands that were popular, like, the Bostons, the Kansas, the Ted Nugent, and all that kind of stuff. That really wasn't my thing, and because I was a weird kid. And Notre Dame is just a few miles away from South Bend, or it's in South Bend, so it was close to me. And they had a guy doing radio. I think it was 10 to midnight on Friday and Saturday. And I discovered it by accident. It's all the way down the dial in the 88 range on FM. And he would play all the stuff that was hitting the coast, because he was from New York, and he'd find stuff from New York and California. Mm-hmm. And when a song hits now, it hits everywhere.
Right.
Then it would hit each coast, and then it would get to us poor people in the Midwest, usually a couple years later. So it really took a long time.
Let me tell you, I'm 46, and I remember those days too.
Yeah.
It was interesting because I moved out to the East Coast. I lived in Savannah, Georgia for about a year. And the culture out there was completely different from Wisconsin, which is where I'm from. I'm from the Madison area. And my eyes were wide open. That was, back when you had the East Coast, West Coast sound, and, a lot of that was going on. Also, the clothing, the music, just culturally, it seemed a lot different. One of the things that the internet's definitely done is, we're accessible to all that almost immediately now, rather than having to wait for it to drift into the middle, if you will.
Yeah. And I feel like it's a blessing and a curse at the same time, because I think we take things for granted, especially the artistry of like a stand-up comic or a band, a new band that's just getting some heat or something like that. We take that for granted, and we don't pick up the whole LP and listen to it front to back and look at the artwork and look at who produced it and stuff like that, because it's just all immediate. It's all in our ear, and we don't have to think about where it came from. We just say, okay, we like this, and then we forget about it.
There's some really great bands out there. I was turned on to one recently it's been around forever. Anthony Green, if you've heard of him. But the artwork...
I haven't.
Amazing musician, but the artwork that he puts into his stuff, it's truly art, and I miss that because you don't get that on the little CDs,
Right.
I actually started going out and buying vinyl again just so that I can have that tangible feeling. And I don't think anything sounds as good as vinyl. The new record players they have now have laser readers, so yeah, it's pretty nice.
Yeah, my brother he's 6 years younger than me, and he's rebuilding and buying new for his vinyl collection. I've got a little vinyl myself. I don't have a turntable, and my problem is I'm mostly deaf. I wear hearing aids when I don't have these earbuds in, and I'm missing a lot of frequencies. So the difference between an LP, because I've tried it, I went into a record store and tried it. The difference between an LP and digital music is nothing to me. I'm missing a whole lot anyway, but I still buy some pretty cool LPs when they do limited pressings and stuff like that anyway. So someday I should probably get a turntable so I can be, one of those LP dudes again,
It's just interesting. I had a CD collection, and they're so small, and you just kind of throw them everywhere. With the vinyl, there's just a different respect that I have for it. And as you grow that, your collection becomes something you're really proud of. At least I am. So, moving forward, so how did you get into stand-up? What did you do when you were out of school? What was your first job?
My first job was a manager of a Farrell's restaurant. So I didn't go to college, and I worked at Farrell's restaurant starting when I was 16 as a busboy. And I worked there for several years, and I ended up becoming promoted to general manager of the South Bend Farrell's when I was 18. And I ran that until they closed it. And then I moved to Indianapolis, and I ran one there for 2.5 or 3 years, and then they closed them all. So that was my first job.
But at least you got into a management position. That must have opened up some doors, hopefully, down the road.
Yeah, I've always been what's called a management candidate, because I think I walk and talk like a manager, and
you got the
I
look.
found out later in life that ain't me. I don't want to do that anymore. So now I just work for myself.
Sure.
But I was a manager for a long time. I was in restaurants and retail up through, I think it was my mid-40s. So, that was 26, 27 years I was doing that.
So, I'd like to explore, it's hard for me to skip from your early youth or your early age to straight stand-up. I'd like to know how you got there. Do you have a funny bone that runs in the family? Was there certain things that happened along the course that brought you there? For me, when I look back, there always seems to be this weird plan behind it all, or at least that's the way it appears.
Yeah.
Do you see that in your own life? And if so, can you share?
Yeah, I feel like my family in general wasn't really fun. Now, my grandma on my dad's side was really outgoing, and she was in the antique business, and she was very well respected as an antique dealer, and she could tell you where anything came from the 1700s all the way through the 1900s. And so she knew a lot of stuff and was outgoing. And I wasn't very outgoing. But I loved comedy. And my first experience that I can remember actually appreciating the art of comedy was Tom Dreesen was on the Mike Douglas show, and I must have been, I think, 9 or 10 years old. And he came on and they usually did like a 5-minute set for the show. And the stuff he did, I just absolutely fell in love with. And once again, there's no internet, so I'm writing the name Tom Dreesen down so that I can remember who he is. And I'm just scanning the TV guide every week for where he was appearing, because he was really hitting it big. This was probably 72, 73. And so he was doing, Mike Douglas, Merv Griffin, Dinah Shore. He was doing Carson quite a bit. So I was always trying to watch him, and that really got me interested. I could tell that there was something to it, and it wasn't as easy as it was.
Sure.
And so I was pretty quiet up until I got into junior high. And then in junior high, the problem with me was I hit, I'm 6'5", and I hit 6'5" about,
hey, Greg, are you here?
I think the
Would you
8th
turn off
grade.
the air filter for
So
me, please?
In
The
7th grade, I
filter?
was probably 6'3".
In here.
And I weighed
I have him muted
no
so
more
you
than
can't hear me.
170 pounds the whole time
this
I was
thing
in
right
high
there.
school.
Just turn it off. Hit the.
So I was taller
power
than
button.
everybody in the high school, and the junior high and the high school mixed, obviously.
behind you.
So they weren't on different floors. They weren't in
Hit the
separate
power button
buildings.
in the
We
middle.
just mixed. Our lockers were right by each
Again.
other. And I was
There you
getting
go.
bullied pretty hard
Thank you.
by the older kids because they didn't like that I was taller than them. So they were doing, slamming me up against lockers and knocking books out of my hand and all kinds of stuff. And I found out then I had a temper, and that I didn't take any crap from them, so I was always fighting, and I had to get out of the fighting because I was getting in trouble
Sure.
for fighting them. And I started using humor as a way to get around that. So
Okay.
I just acted goofy, and it worked. So that was really when I started, kind of being not necessarily a class clown, but when there was two things I did. I'd act goofy if the heat was ever coming down, not because I was afraid of being picked on. I was afraid of my response because my responses were pretty violent.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started questioning authority big time. So most of my humor was telling a teacher that I didn't know how to teach, trying to make a teacher cry. It was mean, and and that type of stuff. And so I was getting in trouble for something new. I was getting sent to the office for questioning a teacher rather than getting into a fight.
Sure. So it sounds like you found that humor affects people in certain ways, and maybe even in a way that was a little disarming to some of the bullies, right? So instead of wanting to continue in that aspect, they kind of got disarmed by that. I mean, that's a tool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have that too, and I used to be very much like that. Except I was kind of the class clown, or at least turned into the class clown.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that humor, especially for a comedian, and I'm guessing because that's something that I'm not as experienced in as per se you, but I could see it being this way. Is that you find things that trigger people, that brings out this laughter is an emotion, and sometimes you can't control that, right? Uncontrollable
Right.
laughter, just outbursts of, oh my God, that's so funny, and it just hits you the right way.
Yeah.
Your
Mm.
job, or a comedian job, is to find those cue points and trigger it, and it becomes kind of an artistic style in a way, right?
Yes, very much so.
How would you describe your comedy?
I would say, first of all, I was to compare myself to anybody, I'd say it's kind of a cross between Dave Letterman and Ray Romano.
Okay.
So I do some Dave Letterman, just goofy type stuff. That if you look back at his stand-up, it was a lot of a little bit non sequitur type stuff, but told in just a regular voice. He wasn't super wacky on stage, but he had a weird sense of humor. And then Ray Romano does a lot of family stuff and talks about his life, and I do that a lot as well. I have pretty much stayed in the clean arena, even though I cuss a lot as a regular human being. And I just decided that, first of all, I look like a high school science teacher, and or maybe your pharmacist or history teacher or a basketball coach. And I don't look like somebody's going to come up and drop a bunch of F-bombs. So I stay in my lane as far as that's concerned, and it makes me more comfortable, so I stay clean. And a lot of personal experience, a lot of self-deprecating stuff. So it's not like a laugh a minute type thing. I don't do a lot of one-liners. I usually do a joke that has 2 or 3 different tags and it lasts a little bit longer. So almost a storyteller.
Sure. I've heard that expression a lot, and I know what it means, but for our listeners who especially may be interested in getting into comedy, you talk about staying in your lane. Can you expound on that a little bit more? Like how do you find your niche? Because that's kind of your niche, right? Is your lane. How do you find your lane as a new comic?
Well, most new comics don't find it. It takes a lot of young comics a lot of years. I interview a lot of comics, and a lot of them said that they were totally different when they started. And, it can take 5, 10 years for some people. Now, I feel like, first of all, I don't have any pressure because comedy isn't the way I want to make a living. It's more of a hobby.
Sure.
So I don't have any pressure when I go on stage. I've talked in front of people before. That doesn't make me very nervous. I enjoy it, so that's not a problem. So I don't have the pressure of, hey, I got to make it. I got to do something. This is the only way I'm going to pay my bills because I'm unemployable otherwise. So, I don't have any of that going on.
Right.
So, but they do, and so they're trying as hard as they can. And sometimes when you try so hard, you don't find what you want to do. You don't find what they call it your voice. What your comedy voice is. So I feel like I just found it right away. It's very easy for me to just go up and tell some stories and make jokes, and I get into the art of it and changing it around and stuff like that. But it takes a long time to find out who you are. And honestly, a lot of young comics I see, they come up, they first start doing like puns and one-liners, a lot of what I call dirty jokes that go into anything that you would consider that you wouldn't see like on network TV,
Sure.
that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they go right there because that's what they know. But I felt that a lot of them have to go through that. I mean, what I try to do is I put myself in the same spot. So say I started when I was like 22, I'd be exactly like them.
Mm-hmm.
I would, I wouldn't have the maturity. I wouldn't have any business sense to me. I wouldn't have gone through life experiences that are a lot more difficult than going up and doing 5 or 10 minutes of stand-up comedy. None of that would have been part of me, so I would have been exactly like them, and they're just going to have to learn and grow as they learn and grow,
Well, you kind of evolve, right? And then it sounds kind of like a business where you kind of start it, but it kind of grows into its own thing, and So you kind of watch it grow as you keep developing it. This is the best way I can equate it. Is that kind of how that works? You kind of start it,
Yeah,
and then it kind of morphs as you work at it, and you work with your material into something maybe different than how you originally started.
Yeah, I think it takes a combination of self-awareness and self-confidence to be able to understand what's working and what's not working for you.
Sure.
And that's tough.
Where do you think you got most of your self-confidence from? A lot of people struggle with that. Is that something that you just kind of, over the course of years, it came to you, or have you always been just confident as an individual?
I've always been fairly confident, and I feel like I can look people in the eye and talk to them without a problem. I've never had any fear of public speaking, and I've always been confident in the things that I do, and I don't overthink things too much. In to the point that I sometimes jump the gun and jump in and do stuff that I probably shouldn't because I think it's a good idea at the time, but a little bit impulsive, you know. But yeah, I think that the self-confidence was never a problem for me because if you tell me to do something, I'm just going to do it.
Sure. So how long have you been doing stand-up then? I mean, I know because I'm looking at it, but I'm just trying to feed you. I mean, it's only been for the last few years or so, correct?
Yeah, I think I'm coming up on maybe 4.5 years. So I'm 56. I started when I was 52. And the way I started is kind of funny. I've been working for the same company for almost 16 years now. And I had never gone to the company holiday party ever. It's just I do work, and going to the party just wasn't my thing. But the guy who was running it was friendly with me. We both worked in the same area as account managers, and he was putting together. And he says, "You know what? I really want you to do stand-up comedy as the entertainment for our show because they've been hiring like a magician for the last few years, and they said we're tired of the magician. We want you to do the stand-up comedy."
So you must have been known as the funny guy because people are usually known to stick you with that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm always the one that they would turn to in the meetings to give comedy relief, and
Nice.
I can do stuff off the cuff pretty good, so I did that. So he's pushing me to do it, and I'm saying no because I'm not a stand-up comic, and I had to do 45 minutes, and nobody does 45 minutes their first time. So I kept saying no. He kept asking me. I think probably the third or fourth time he asked me, I finally came home and I told my wife, I said, "Lisa, this guy at work's bugging me to do this holiday party and do stand-up comedy." And she said, "Well, you know you want to do it, so do it." And so I said yes.
Behind
and I started.
Every great man, there's a great woman, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I had a couple. Yeah, no doubt. She knows what I want. So sometimes I just need that push. But they gave me a couple months to prepare, so I'm putting stuff together. And you know, when you work with people, it's real easy to just roast them and stuff like that. So I started putting those notes together, and it came up to the day. Yeah. But Lisa kept asking me if I was nervous, and I'm like, "No, I'm not nervous at all. I don't have any qualms about doing it." Mm-hmm. I said I would do it, so now I'm going to do it. I woke up the day of, and we were in the middle. Being in Wisconsin, we're part of this too. I think it was the record cold temperatures for the record amount of time that went, like, I think late November all the way through almost to March, and the Lake Michigan completely froze over.
Yeah, that's a few years ago.
Yeah. And that's when I did that, and so my wife and I are big hikers, and I woke up that morning, and my wife told me that I looked as scared as I have ever looked. We've been together for 37 years, and I freaked out. I totally freaked out, and I said, I have to go out and do something physical. And it was like -2. You know, it was starting to warm up, so it was only -2. I said, let's go to Lake Michigan and look at the ice shelves, because when Lake Michigan freezes, it makes these really cool ice shelves, and it looks like you're on a different planet, and it's really weird because it's silent. So we went there and did a little bit of hiking, got bundled up, did a little bit of hiking, and then when I came back, I was fine. And all the nerves were gone, and I felt pretty good. I went, did the show, and they asked me to come back the next year. so that means I did okay. I roasted people. I did a few jokes that none of them do I do now. They've all gone. But after I did that, I was like, you know what? I kind of want to do this for real. And I started doing some open mics and getting friendly with some comedians and stuff like that. And, you know, I was really just kind of messing around with it, not doing anything serious. And then last year, right before COVID hit, I was starting to get pretty serious and going up into Michigan and doing some stuff and really working on my act. And then COVID hit, and that kind of pulled the rug out from under me. But it's still part of me. I still do it.
So I have a question. How do you find the circuit to perform on? Is there? I mean, I know that there's a circuit, and there's a couple different ones, if I'm not mistaken, right? There's like one in the Midwest, East Coast, West Coast. How does that work out?
Yeah.
And how do you get if you're up and coming and you're trying, or not even up and coming, but if you're new and you're trying to get your foot in the door so that you can practice your material, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So we call them scenes, and obviously the closest scene to you and I is the Chicago scene, which is actually rivaling both New York and LA as far as the sheer density and amount of comedians and the talent. So they're doing very well. And for me to try to crack into that scene, I'm not ready yet. The funny thing is you got to be doing it for five or 10 years before you're ready to really do that.
Sure.
So I've been getting in the smaller scenes, like Kalamazoo, Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And what most of the comics that I talk to, their advice is, instead of trying to get on a show, make your own show. And so I did that. I did that last year when I was starting to get serious. I've got a friend that owns a bar that's a rock bar, and I asked for Thursday night and started doing either a headliner show or a showcase, like 2 Thursdays a month. And I was doing that for a while, and I really learned a lot. And with that, I met some people. Some people were starting to call me and say, "Hey, let me get on that show," and stuff like that. So that was pretty cool doing that. And then COVID, the last one I did was in January.
Yeah.
And
everybody.
Yeah. So, but made some contacts, and that was kind of during that time was when I decided to do the podcast too. So, I'd been doing a local podcast for almost 5 years and decided to put that one away and start a new one. So the pandemic was good for that in a way because people were available.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and it's a platform for you, right? And just to plug that, your podcast is called Behind the Bits. And you can find him on Instagram, and what other platforms are you on? Are you on all the major, like Apple, iTunes?
Spotify,
Okay.
I think the podcast goes everywhere. The only one that hasn't taken me yet, I think, is Pandora. I think you probably know that's a tough one to crack.
It is, and it takes a long time. I heard it can take up to 6 months. So.
Yeah. So I've applied. Yeah. So I'm on all the stuff, and the funny thing is so on Instagram everything's behind the bits. So if you look up Behind the Bits on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of that. That's where I'm at. And the only thing is I think Behind the Bits is taken on Twitter, so I'm BTBPC, something like that. But Behind the Bits still takes you to me. So that's what I do as far as socials, pretty much just those three.
So I see a couple people that I'm a little envious of. You got to talk to Larry Hankin, which is amazing comedian. Who's your favorite so far?
Well, really my favorite was my first. It was Tom Dreesen, because he was my first guy. You know, he was my first comic that I saw when I was 10 years old. And
so he was your first guest. That's amazing.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, and that's the way I planned it. So I have never planned a whole lot of things in my life, but I really planned this podcast because I wanted it to be right. So what I did is I listened to all the comedy interview podcasts I could, and I marked down what I liked and what I didn't like about it. Mm-hmm. And so I was very methodical in saying, okay, this is what I want and this is what I don't want. So what I wanted was a podcast that I learned from comedians what it takes to write jokes, what it takes to get booked on shows, what it takes to get paid, you know, everything that it takes to be a comedian, what it takes to write for another show or another comedian, mm-hmm. what it takes to get into acting, all the different avenues that come from being a stand-up comedian that you can do. And so I wanted to learn. I didn't want any small talk at all. And it kind of reminds me of how you do your interview. We didn't spend 20 minutes talking about the weather. And we didn't spend 20 minutes talking about stuff that nobody wants to hear. You get right into the interview. So that's one of the things I wanted to do. So I had all that together. I was in a Facebook group with Tom, and I had interacted with him a couple times, and I just sent him a message. I said, hey, I'm starting this podcast. I'd really like you to be my first guest. And he sent me a message with his phone number. He said, call me, let's talk about it. So he wanted to make sure I was on the up and up. I wasn't trying to do anything shady. And, you know, he's 81 years old himself. So he's not real super up with technology, but better than most 80-year-olds. And so I talked to him about that first joke that I thought was so great, and I totally screwed it up. I said it wrong, and he said, I haven't done that joke for 35 years, but I can tell it to you right. So he did that. and then the funny thing is I interviewed him, and I wanted that to come out as my first episode in January, and I interviewed him like in November, and his interview with Mark Maron on the WTF podcast had come out probably 3 or 4 weeks prior to mine. And funny thing is, I was still pretty green as an interviewer, and I was like dumbfounded that I had Tom Dreesen on the phone with me. So that, that was, it's hard to talk to your idol. And so I had that going on. But I listened back to the podcast. I got him to talk about stuff that he hasn't talked about on any other podcast before. So I was pretty proud of that.
Yeah. No, when you make that connection, that's awesome. And
yeah,
you just kind of tend to pull out some of those hidden stories. I've had a couple really treasured moments so far in my own podcasting. And it's amazing because, those are stories that, he's 80-something now. And people don't get to hear, wouldn't have heard.
Yep.
And you still get to share that. So I love that about my job.
Yeah. And it's really neat. One thing people don't understand about podcasting is, okay, you're doing all these interviews and you're talking to a lot of people, and some of them are just interviews. Some of the people I talk to and I get a great interview out of them, and then I don't think of them. And then I'm sure it's the same for you. Right. And that's okay, because that's what podcasting is all about. But you connect with some people too.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
You make those connections. And I've made friends with people who have been on the podcast, and I think that's really cool too.
It's that networking. I was just talking the other day about the 6 degrees of separation. Are you familiar?
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And it's true. In a podcasting aspect, the more or the larger your network, the easier it becomes to find really interesting people to be able to hopefully talk to and connect with.
Right.
So, tell me, what are you doing now? Obviously, we're doing the podcast behind the bits, but with COVID hitting, we have vaccinations now that are becoming available. Are you starting to schedule? Are things starting to, at least on the scheduling aspect, resume, or are we still on a lockdown? Especially for you folks in
So,
comedy.
yeah, so some comics are out there working. So Florida is allowing some stuff to happen. A guy I just talked to had just gotten back to doing, I think, 5 or 6 dates, 5 or 6 weekends in Florida. So they're allowing it. There's clubs, depending on what state you're in, that are. I think Ohio is allowing some, and it's like either 50% or 25% capacity, and following all the guidelines and all that jazz. I personally am taking the stance that we're still in lockdown, and I'm 56 years old. I've had pneumonia 2 times out of the last 3 years, and I'm trying to stay safe. And I also don't want to, I don't want to present a situation where I am the cause of a super spreader.
Right.
So even if I don't get it, if I follow all the guidelines, you can't control what the people that come to your show do. You can tell them where to sit. You can say leave your mask on, and then they can go out in the parking lot and hug and share a cigarette or whatever. And then what did you do? You created a environment that people could get COVID. So my personal stance is I'm going to stay away from it until I know that a lot of people are vaccinated. I'm vaccinated, and I feel like it's safe.
Sure. How has the pandemic affected the smaller clubs? I mean, I always hear about like the comedy club and the large places that are really suffering, but my mind then goes to the small guy, because they don't have that reserve. Have you seen a lot of closures? How has that affected our smaller comedy clubs?
Yeah, a lot of the smaller ones have closed, or they've started like GoFundMe's just to pay the rent. Some of the big ones are closed. Dangerfield's closed, and
which is amazing. I mean, I would
yeah,
not have thought that. They've been,
yeah.
I mean, that's a staple.
Yeah, and I feel like that. Yeah, I feel like that more are going to, and what's going to happen is those buildings are going to be available, and somebody's going to buy it, and a certain percentage of them are going to stay comedy clubs. And I feel like there is going to be a huge demand for live comedy when things open back up, just like live music. That's one of the things I miss so much is going out to watch live music.
Yeah, me too. Just getting out of the house and actually watching a nice gig somewhere. I mean, in my area, we have several large venues that always have different concerts going on with the big names. But even just going somewhere small and having a glass of wine, or just taking a girl on a date, I miss that.
Oh, and, yeah, big time.
Yeah, so I'm very eager for this pandemic to finally reach the hump.
Yeah.
But, let's let me talk about a couple things with you. So, one of the things that I have a tough time with is this stimulus package that they just handed out. $600 for the first one and $1,200 for the other. I know so many people in the Midwest that are suffering, and it seems to be such a slap across the face. I'm not sure what your opinion of that is. I mean, I don't want to put our country in debt, but when we're putting out that kind of money and most of it's going to that upper percentage of the rich, I have a tough time watching that. And then we're just supposed to be okay with it. There's so many
Yeah.
people, the businesses that are folding because of just the lockdown. What's your comic interpretation of that? Have you ever written, or have you written material on it? What can you do to make
Oh
it
man. Yeah. The problem is I don't do any of that type of comedy just
no
because I would get mad. But I got to tell you that I do know that in the stand-up community, the people who were making a living doing stand-up have absolutely hit rock bottom,
Yeah.
and that's why some of them are they're doing shows in places where they could potentially get COVID or something like that because they're just trying to stay afloat. They're trying to make rent, and some of them have become homeless. Some of them have not been able to pay rent for a number of months. They've lost cars and stuff like that. So it's devastating. $600 doesn't do anything. I mean, in Chicago, that might buy some groceries for a couple, and that's about it.
Yeah.
So it's a total slap in the face, and the way when you look at where all the other money went, and the fact that Jeff Bezos is still not paying any taxes, I think it's a total crock.
We have some serious issues, and at least we have more awareness of it. But if this election and the last 8 years or more has taught us anything, is we're in excuse my expression, a shit show circus, and these older, just a couple of, I don't like putting my opinion in there. we need to have an age limit to our politicians, and we need to have a term limit on how long you can serve. If you're a career politician that's in there for 60 years and you're controlling everything, that's a problem. It's easier for lobbyists to control those types of people than someone that's always fresh, I would think.
Right.
Who knows? Something's got to give. We need comedy because the mental state of people in the U.S. is horrible right now. People fighting, amongst families and just the civil discord and unrest that you can feel across the nation. And you watch the news, and it's so... there's nothing hardly ever that you smile about and say, "Oh, I'm proud to be an American." It's always something serious going on.
Yeah, and there's a lot, and the nice thing is that the virtual comedy world really blew up during this pandemic, and
it did.
I didn't embrace it a lot, but I have done some shows, and I hated doing it a couple times, and a couple times I felt like I did pretty good, and so it's totally different.
Is it hard not feeding off the reaction of the crowd?
Well, it sucks, but it's not so bad when you get on a roll and you're like in a Zoom room and you actually hear some people laugh, even though it's like a second after the punchline because of the lag and stuff like that. Right. I mean, you got to learn to do longer pauses in between the punch and the next joke and stuff like that. So it's a different animal. But I found some people. I actually did a comedy contest earlier this year that was sponsored by the podcast, and so I had 21 entrants, and it was a big mix. There was people who have been doing comedy 10 or more years. It was some people who were had been doing it for 4 or 5 years, and there were some people on it that just started this year and have never done a live gig. And my top 3 was a person who had been doing it for just a couple years, a guy who's been doing it for over 10 years, and a guy who started in March. and he's from Scotland, so they had a bigger they had a tighter lockdown than we did.
Sure.
And the funny thing is the guy from Scotland took second place, and the dude writes like 8 hours a day. He says he's got over 40,000 one-liners in a notebook right now. So a lot of people are trying. Yeah, a lot of people are trying. Now, is this going to, what I want to see, is this going to translate to these people getting on a stage and having the same effect? Because we both know it's two different things.
Right. It's,
yeah, watching virtual comedy is kind of like watching a YouTube video, and real comedy is, you can see the sweat pouring down the guy's face when he's eating shit out there.
Right. Yeah.
Pardon my language.
No, you get that. There's this a new dimension when you're live rather than when you're doing it virtually, and hopefully, like you said, I think there's going to be a percentage that are going to reopen underneath some new management. It's just a shame that it had to be like that. And and one thing that I encourage listeners and everybody for that matter is the idealisms that we have start with us, and we spread them by the way that we live and the people that we interact with. We show them through our actions, right? And if we just focus on individually being better, taking a little bit more responsibility and trying to make a change in the world, right now there's something going on civilly on this discord, fake news, all the stuff that's bombarding us these days, that we just need to try to keep it together. Comedy for me has been that sinew or that stitch in the fabric of society that brings commonality. We can laugh at each other. We can laugh at situations. We can, let loose. And typically, even back in the day at a comedy club, you might see segregated people, even when that wasn't the thing back then. It's because comedy brings people together, and so I hope that we can survive this pandemic mostly intact. I don't know, anything that we can do to, our listeners can do. What can we do to help, at least the comedy community focus?
Well,
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, one thing that I think is a big deal, and I think you touched on it, is we've got a lot of big problems. The problems with our country is big. Climate change. Everything is big, but we've got a lot of little problems in our own communities and within our even virtual communities, like people that I've met online. Just take one. Just take one thing and help that. Help the homeless in your area. Help one comedian that is struggling. They're suffering from depression or whatever. Just connect with them and help them. One person. That's all you need to do. And if everybody did that, then everybody would be better. So that's what I say. As far as if you want to support comics, a lot of comics have podcasts, and listen to their podcasts so they can get sponsored.
Right.
So look for the ones that don't have the big names. Always look for an independent podcast. That's one thing I always try to do, is find a new independent podcast that is going on that I enjoy, and that's a big thing for me. I've gone from listening to all the big ones to just looking for these great independent podcasts where the people actually care.
That you can find out there,
oh yeah.
Yeah. So I really appreciate that too. I try to make a mention of them when I find them. It's just an interesting time that we're living in right now, period. So I am looking forward to getting back into the social swing and not being stuck at home. I think that'll help. One last thing that I wanted to kind of ask about is comedians seem to be at higher risk for mental health issues and depression and anxiety, especially during this pandemic. Would you agree with that? And what have you seen personally?
Agree 100%. Comedians in general, most of us are broken. There's something wrong. Right. and I'm no different. So the things that are wrong get multiplied by so much when you can't do the thing that you love. And that if you can't go out and do stand-up comedy, even the money part, I mean, even though you're bleeding money and you can't make rent, you can't buy groceries or whatever, the fact that you can't go out and get on a stage and just love is hard on you. So definitely a lot of mental health stuff. I've had a lot of conversations with people, kind of talking them off the ledge. And a lot of the comics I talk to, that I interviewed for the podcast, a lot of them don't want to talk about it on the air, but they'll talk about it afterwards, saying, I'm really having trouble. And I talked to one guy that he's a pretty big guy. He's not, I wouldn't call him a household name, but he's a headliner. And before the show, he said he absolutely cannot talk about the pandemic because I will break down. And he said, I have lost everything. He was a cruise ship guy, worked a lot of cruises, and he said I cannot talk about the pandemic because I'm in a state of mind right now that I can't handle it. So I was glad he said that because it was one of the comments I've had. And then I had another guy, I can name him, John Pavaromo, is one of my favorite guests and a friend of mine now that actually leans in to the depression part because he's got it pretty bad, and he talked about it pretty much the whole hour and a half we talked. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's definitely tough.
I know that it's like one of those the unknowns, behind the door that you don't have awareness of, and that's kind of why I wanted to bring that out because I knew it's a big deal right now. Any comedians listening, just know that we love you.
Yeah.
You keep our fabric of society together. You keep us laughing. You keep us sane half the time. So don't give up. We are with you. We love you. So that's my message to you guys. Scott, it has been a pleasure. Anything that you want to talk about that I haven't hit? Anything you want to share? I want to be able to plug you. Are you doing anything event-wise for your podcast? If not, then, again, the name of your podcast is Behind the Bits.
Right.
And you can find him on any of the major platforms. Also, you do video as well, correct? It's not just audio like I do.
Yeah, I do what's called the rapid round. So I'll live stream about 50 minutes of the interview for Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and then I normally go offline for the rest of it. But my interview is pretty similar to yours, in that talk about real stuff and try to find out what the person you're interviewing is interested in and take it from there. So my episodes come out every Tuesday at midnight, and I go weekly. I also have a pretty cool thing that I'm doing that I really enjoy called the BTB Internet Talk Show. Now that is a fully streamed live.
That didn't come through.
Yeah.
Clear.
Okay. Yeah, it's the BTB Internet Talk Show. And I actually do that on Thursday nights. I'm done for the rest of the year. I'm going to come back in January, but that is at 8 p.m. Eastern, and it's on the Behind the Bits Facebook page and the YouTube page and the Twitter page. I do that live. And I have guests on that sometimes are other podcasters, sometimes it's comedians, sometimes it's actors, sometimes it's pretty famous comedians. And we do about an hour, sometimes a little bit more, of just a wacky talk show. And so instead of people doing like this, what I do is I set people up and let them promote their stuff, and then they can do a bit. And then I've actually got a part of that where Dean Martin comes out and talks to everybody, because he was actually cryogenically frozen in 1995 and they thawed him out, and poor guy was out of money, so he lives with me now. So we bring him out and have some fun. So that's actually been received very well, and so it also helped the podcast out quite a bit.
Nice. Anybody have something going on virtually that you might want to plug comedian-wise? I know you kind of got your finger on the pulse for the holiday.
I lost
Christmas.
it as well.
I'm sorry. Is there any virtual events going on that we can, as our listeners, for either Christmas or New Year's that we could log in on from home and help support? Either for you or perhaps one of your friends that are comedians? Any virtual...
Yeah, actually, there's a couple things I'd like to plug. If you go to the Art of Bombing podcast, he is doing a show, I believe it is this weekend, and he's got some great people on it. His name's Dan Douglas Jr., and he was just in the World Series of Comedy. He's a semifinalist, and really great guy. So he's doing a show, I believe it's this weekend. I just did the show last weekend with him. And if anybody's interested in getting into stand-up comedy, but they don't know what to do, there is a group called Hot Breath, and it's actually started out as a podcast from Joel Byers. And if you go to the Hot Breath, I think, writing room, they every day at 10 o'clock, they do a writing workshop where they give you a random word and you have to write a joke about it. And it's a great exercise for new comics. And I can't recommend that enough because it kind of kept me sane during the early parts of the pandemic. When I was stuck at home, I would stop working and write 10 thing, and you have to write for 10 minutes and come up with a joke. And I was doing that, and he's getting over 100 people on each one of his live feeds now doing that. So that's a cool thing if anybody's interested in getting into stand-up, but they don't know what to do.
Awesome. Well, Scott, I appreciate your time today. It's been an honor talking to you, sir. I actually wouldn't mind reaching out to you maybe 6 months to a year and revisiting and seeing how you're doing post-pandemic and how things have changed.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd love it.
Okay.
Hopefully I'm up on a stage and I'm doing my Netflix special or something.
Absolutely. Fingers crossed. I'm rooting for you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. I'm going to reach out to you then, and we'll stay in touch. But you have yourself a great Christmas and a Happy New Year, buddy. And keep smiling
you too.
And keep sharing those laughs, okay?
Yeah, I definitely will. And thanks for doing what you're doing. This is a really good show.
I appreciate that. You have yourself a great day, buddy. Take care now.
You too.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Are you still here?